Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out this afternoon. I am Lissa Muscatine. I'm one of the owners of the bookstore along with my husband, Brad Graham. And on behalf of our fantastic staff here, we welcome you to one of, we were just counting up the other day, we think it's about 475 of these author events that we host in the store every year. So we are happy to have you here on a Sunday afternoon. This is part of our mission is to help strengthen our community by providing a forum for ideas and discussion. And I think there's probably no better book and no better author to be sort of our exhibit A of that philosophy. So thank you, Betty, for helping us in that regard. And it is a pleasure to welcome Betty Medsger to Politics and Prose for her new book, The Burglary. I'm sure many of you know Betty, and if you don't, she herself is no stranger to Washington, having been a reporter at the Washington Post during what many still think of as the heyday of the newspaper, the era of the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and Watergate. And it was back in the early 70s that she reported on a story exposing the secret surveillance of American citizens by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. The information was gleaned from FBI documents that had been stolen in a burglary at the this is so funny. I have a son who goes to Swarthmore College, and Media, Pennsylvania is right up the road, and we go and have dinner there with him sometimes. And I'm trying to compute that this sort of historic moment and incident took place in little old Media. But it did. Media, Pennsylvania. These documents were subsequently provided to Betty at the Post. Now, she never knew, as most of you probably know if you've read the book or read reviews of it, she never knew the exact identities of her sources or who precisely conducted the burglary. And more astonishing is that the FBI never figured that out either. Maybe that's sort of part of the point here. But the documents did shed light on the extent of Hoover's illicit and illegal spying on Americans of various political and social stripes, principally those he did not agree with, did not like, or whatever. And it was Betty's stories in the Post and other reports about his tactics that helped slowly shift public opinion about the Vietnam War. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward about 40 years, and through a combination of coincidence and serendipity, Betty discovered who the burglars were. And then she got them to agree, or at least some of them to agree, to go public with the inside story of the burglary, hence the title of this fascinating, compelling, and really most important book. In her account of the burglary itself and of the people behind it, we get a much more subtle and rich portrait of the politics and attitudes of that tumultuous era. And we certainly come away with a deeper appreciation of the nature and role of civil disobedience and why public access to information is so essential to the integrity of our democracy. And I think probably one reason that we're also interested is because that topic remains so resonant and so relevant today. I should just note that in the intervening decades between the original stories and the book, Betty served as dean of the journalism school at San Francisco State University, authored several books, and now divides her time between Connecticut and New York. I should also say that she had some time lived in Berkeley when she was out on the West Coast. I'm from Berkeley. My parents were good friends of hers, so this has a personal meaning for me to have her here as well. And I just have to say the other thing is that the incident that's the focus of the book and the protagonists of this story were all located near Philadelphia. And yet, when you read it, especially if you're from Washington or have lived in Washington for a long time, I just have to say it does have the intrigue of a sort of quintessential Washington story. So for that and many, many other reasons, we are very, very pleased and delighted to welcome you back to Washington, and especially to Politics and Prose.
It is wonderful to be here, and I feel as though there are people from all parts of my life. Lissa, from when I first went to Berkeley, even some of my Grove City College classmates are here, and then many friends from the years I was in Washington, so it feels great. And as to media being an unusual place for this to happen, it sort of reminds me of something Calvin Trillin said several years ago when somebody asked him, "Why do you write for The Nation?" You know, as though he could write for anything he wanted to. And he said, "Well, it's the magazine closest to my apartment." And that's sort of the way this was. Bill Davidon, the leader of the burglars, at first thought, well, I'll see whether there's any possibility that the Philadelphia FBI office could be burglarized. And he went downtown one day to the office of the Resistance, and while he was there, he discovered that the FBI office there was in a very high building with 24-hour security, and that was no possibility. And then one day he thought, well, I shouldn't give up on this. And he looked in his local phone book and found that there was an FBI office close to his home in Media, Pennsylvania. So that's how it happened that it was in Media. Most places, and this may be an exception, I find that either people are my age and too old to remember what happened back then, or they're too young to be expected to remember. And so I find that it helps to remind people what that time was like as far as the FBI was concerned, and why people would do such an extreme thing, but also the extreme information that they found and why this matters. It's hard to imagine today that any official, and particularly an intelligence official, could be so revered and so iconic as J. Edgar Hoover was prior to March 8th, 1971. And this was as he wanted it. He had created he'd been FBI director since 1924. That also is very hard for us to imagine, that somebody would be an official of a major part of the federal government for what was 47 years at the time that the burglary took place. He was 29 years old when he was appointed FBI director. And there was no oversight of the FBI, no congressional oversight, no executive oversight. And as much as we may complain today about the quality of the oversight, those mechanisms are in place, and can be used at varying degrees according to the political will. He had a reputation of being this much revered figure. There was a part of the FBI that was called the Crime Records Division, which was a purposely misnamed office, quite large. It was the largest government public relations office in the federal government, except for the Marines. And it was paid for by the public, of course. And they turned out many books that were ghost-written by Hoover. They also controlled every movie that Hollywood made about him and about the FBI, which were quite a few. And he always required that he have the right to edit and then finally approve all of the scripts. And that was also true of the weekly TV special on the FBI, called the FBI, that was on every Sunday evening. He had the right to edit and approve and investigate everybody who was an actor or was associated with the programs in any way. A very carefully constructed and preserved image. He had been keeping records, but this was a secret from the public and from most officials ever since the time that he was appointed by Harlan Fiske Stone, who knew that Hoover had this propensity, even as a very young man, to go after political enemies and keep files on them. But he thought that if he simply told him not to do this, that he wouldn't do it. And so he did tell him that this was an unconstitutional thing to do and that he shouldn't do it. But that didn't mean a thing to Hoover, and Hoover just kept doing it. And he was not, there was no oversight. Harlan Fiske Stone just assumed that Hoover would obey what he told him to do. There's a historian of the FBI, Richard Gidd Powers, who I think has described the best what was going on then. He said, Hoover's power to conduct secret operations depended on the absolute freedom he had from any inquiry into the internal operations of the burglary. And then he says, but that changed the night of March 8th, 1971, forever, when a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into the resident agency in Media, Pennsylvania, and the burglars were never caught. And that's true. There were 200 agents who worked hard for 5 years trying to find the burglars. And for various reasons, the search was unsuccessful, despite even creating a raid on a draft board in which the FBI thought that they were all going to be arrested, and that backfired, and the 28 people who were arrested were later acquitted, and the FBI was worse off at the end of that trial than it was in the beginning. It was a rather extraordinary situation, to say the least, that in the absence of official oversight or journalistic oversight, and I shouldn't fail to mention that there were very, very few journalists who wrote about the FBI, except for those whom Hoover had selected and were called friendly journalists, and were invited in sometimes even to see some secret documents when he wanted to smear people by releasing that information. So the unusual circumstance that led to the exposure of the secret FBI was came from the insights and commitment of one person, Bill Davidon. Bill was a physics professor then at Haverford College, veteran of the Navy, but a pacifist after Hiroshima, after the dropping of the bombs, and had been active since then in working to oppose nuclear weapons. He was at the start of the Vietnam War, he was an active opponent from the beginning. And he was involved in several organizations, anti-war peace organizations that were dominated by scientists, by professors of various kinds, and also the resistance and in Philadelphia, a wonderful, large umbrella peace organization there. And he started to be concerned by late 1969 by the fact that there was such a sense of despair in the peace movement. And he was looking for more, what he called more aggressive, nonviolent ways to oppose the war. And he was quite surprised when he found that hope among Catholics. Being a Jewish kid who grew up in the same neighborhood as Philip Roth in Newark, he never expected that he would find these close colleagues and indeed teachers in the Catholic peace movement. But that happened in 1969 as things were getting more and more hopeless from his perspective in the peace movement. In fact, he learned the skills of burglary from nuns and priests, which the burglars, none of whom are nuns and priests, like to draw attention to. And during 1970, I mean, some of you probably remember 1970, and it was, for people in the anti-war movement, it was a quite depressing year. And he discovered from that beginning of that year forward that every place he went among the various peace groups in Philadelphia, the people were taking him aside and talking about the fact that they thought there were spies in their midst. And he really didn't like hearing that, and he didn't believe it. I mean, by personality and by his scientific training, he was not a believer in conspiracies, and also didn't speculate. And so he found this very troubling that people were talking about this, so behind. And so he decided that as he heard it more and more, though, and by people that he trusted more and more, that it probably was true. And we also heard these awful, poisonous comments where people either believed that there were spies in their midst, or they were accusing people who would say that they were mentally ill. It was just a really terrible atmosphere in some parts of the peace movement, and also the civil rights movement. So finally, by early fall of 1970, he was convinced that the rumor was true. And to most people, if they had decided at that point, as many had, I'm sure, that the peace movement was full of FBI informers who were destroying their organization, they would simply think that this was too big a problem to solve. But Bill Davidon had a very different approach to things, and he thought that it was too big a problem not to solve. And by that time, by the early fall of 1970, he became convinced that there were two wars to oppose: the war in Vietnam and the war against dissent at home. And he thought it was as important to stop the war in dissent as it was to stop the war in Vietnam. And he had two rather strong beliefs that fueled his moving forward once he reached those conclusions. First of all, he, not just in a rhetorical way, but in a deeply committed way, believed that a citizen is responsible for his or her government, and when you believe that mistakes are being made, you have a responsibility to try to convince the government to do something about it. And then coupled with that, he also had a very strong belief that despite the adoration of Hoover at that time, that if presented with evidence, Americans would demand that official suppression of dissent be stopped. I imagine if anybody had suggested that idea at the time, the answer would not have been that. It turned out that he was right. He thought the key to all of that, though, was evidence. He was very concerned about rhetoric being damaging. There were many people in the movement, for instance, who would say, of course there's spying going on. And he thought, this is not going to change the situation. It's going to build deeper cynicism. We have to find out if this is actually happening. He knew that no one had ever investigated Hoover, and he also felt that no one ever would. And if you think about that time, you would probably agree that his conclusion was reasonable. Congress had shown no interest, and certainly Nixon and the Attorney General, John Mitchell, were not going to investigate whether the FBI was spying. So he concluded that the only way that you could get evidence would be by breaking into an FBI office and stealing it. A burglary was repugnant to him, as it had been when he participated in one of the draft raids with the Catholic Peace Movement. But he felt that there was no other way that you could get the result that he wanted to achieve. So by late December, he decided to start asking some people whom he really trusted what they thought of the idea of burglarizing an FBI office, and if they agreed with him that this should be considered, would they join with him in planning it. He went to 9 different people, and all but one of them agreed. After the shock and taking time to think about the question, they all agreed that it was an important thing, that they were willing to risk decades of their life, decades of their freedom to do. Only one person, a philosophy professor, said no. All the rest decided that it was important enough to pursue. There was a 9th burglar. In the end, there were 8. But there was a 9th burglar who was among those who agreed. And then, just a few days before the burglary took place, came in one evening as they were having their regular planning sessions and said, I'm leaving the group. And no one remembers that they asked him why, or that he said why, or that they asked him to commit to not telling. They just remember him coming in saying that and leaving. And it didn't change their commitment to move ahead, despite the fact that he knew every single element of their plans. And a few weeks after the burglary, he came to the home of 2 of the burglars, the couple, and told them he was thinking of turning them in. Now, I'd like to tell you briefly about the 8 people. I've told you about Bill Davidon, the physics professor who conceived the idea and who was the leader throughout the process, including the distribution plan afterwards. Keith Forsyth and Bob Williamson were 2 of the burglars. And Keith and Bob were among the people some of you may have known in that era. They were people who were about 20 years old and had dropped out of college so that they could spend most of their time working to stop the war, and also were looking for more aggressive forms of nonviolence in order to oppose the war. Keith was a part-time cab driver who had come to Philadelphia from a small town in Ohio, dropped out of Worcester College. Bob Williamson, actually the only Catholic in the group. The FBI was sure they were all Catholics. Bob Williamson was from a small town in central New Jersey, and he was working part-time as a social worker for the state of Pennsylvania at the time of the burglary. Keith, I should point out, took a correspondence course in locksmithing in order to figure out how to become an expert lockpicker. And I'll tell you more about that later. It didn't work out quite the way they expected it to. And two other people, I should say, there were 8 burglars, and 7 of the 8, all 7 whom I found, all 7 did cooperate and with telling me their stories. But 2 of them chose not to be identified, for different personal reasons. And one of them was Ron Durst. And Ron Durst at that time was in his mid-20s and was in graduate school studying to be in a health profession. And his motivation came from his childhood experience. His parents were both Holocaust survivors, and he grew up hearing stories night after night at the family table about the uncles and aunts he never met. And so he adopted at the core of his being the idea of never again. And then as he grew older and was deeply involved in the peace movement, he also felt that again very strongly, never again for Vietnamese people and Cambodians as they were being affected by us. And then two other people, the 8th person I never found, by the way, but 2 other people, John and Bonnie Raines. They were a couple with 3 children under 8 years old at the time of the burglary. And they were the first people that Bill Davidon went to. And they had, John was a religion professor at Temple University at the time, and Bonnie was the director of a daycare center. And they had a very unusual philosophy that even in that rather extreme time, I think that you would find people quite astonished by it. John had gone south beginning in 1961 as a freedom rider, and almost every summer after that, deeply involved in the civil rights movement while he was a doctoral student at Union Seminary in Christian social ethics, never quite realizing that he was going to do so much more than teach Christian social ethics. And they had made an agreement with each other that during that time that he was involved in the civil rights movement, they had made an agreement with each other that they would try to find the courage, if the time ever came, that they had an opportunity to work together to resist some extreme type of injustice, that they hoped that they would be able to do that together despite the fact that they had children. And their rationale was that for most people, because they had children, for a very large segment of the population at any time, that people felt that they could drop out of this kind of very strong activism because of their obligation to their families. And they felt that that was a cop-out, and that meant that at any given time there were people who could have made a significant contribution and didn't. And so when Bill Davidon asked them to think about this, and they thought long and hard, they finally decided that this was such a time and that they would do this. And they made arrangements with his brother and later with her parents to raise their children if, in fact, they went to prison. So the group started planning in early January, many weeks of casing every night, and also they chose a night for the burglary. And they needed to choose a night of the week that would be like the time that they would actually do the burglary. And so one night just seemed the same as any other night. And then one of them remembered that on March 8th, a very special event was scheduled. The Ali Frazier Fight was going to be held at Madison Square Garden. And this was going to be Ali's first fight since he had been, for 6 years, since he had been convicted for refusing to serve in the military, and because as a result of his opposition to the Vietnam War. And so there was great excitement about this fight. It was sold out immediately as soon as the tickets went on sale, within hours. And it was, in advance, it was called the Fight of the Century, which it is still called. And there, the burglars' theory was, and it turned out to be true, that the fight would provide sound cover for them. That everybody, I forgot to tell you, that the FBI office was an office on the second floor of a building that had 2 floors above with apartments where residents lived. And so their theory was that on that night, that first of all, no self-respecting FBI agent would think of coming to work. Well, actually, they had never seen one at work after 5 o'clock in all their months of casing anyhow. But they don't take any chances. They also thought that it was likely, or possible at least, that no media police officer would be patrolling that night during the hours that the fight was going on. And they also hoped that many of the people who lived on the floors above the FBI office and the manager of the building who lived on the floor beneath the FBI office would have their radios and televisions on, listening to the reports on the fight. And that turned out to be true. When Keith was at a crucial point, he could hear the sound of the fight, and thought maybe they didn't hear me. But the burglary was almost called off, because when Keith, the locksmith, arrived at the FBI office, he found out that there were 2 locks on the door, not the 1 lock that he remembered seeing there. And he was stunned, and the second lock that had been added was a much more complicated lock, and he was completely unable to pick it. And so he found a payphone down the street, and he called back to where the burglars were in a motel a few miles away, and said, "I think we have to call it off." And he went back to the motel, and thanks to Bill Davidon, they decided, they were calm, and they decided, we don't really know if anybody knows about it. I don't think I would have concluded that. Let's move ahead. And they succeeded that night, and you know the rest of the story probably, and that is that they found crucial FBI files. One of the first ones, within an hour, when they emptied the 8 big suitcases of the files that they had stuffed in the dark, the first file that they found was one that became emblematic of the burglary. And it was the one that said, it was instructions to agents to enhance the paranoia and make people think there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox. And that was a stunning thing to them, and it was to me when I received the file, but it also was to the public. I'd like to emphasize that unlike other whistleblowers that we've heard from, they had no idea whether they'd find a thing. They were outsiders as opposed to insiders, and yet they were willing to take this risk. Just looking at what the files revealed in addition to that statement of goal. For one thing, they learned in that first set, they continued to send the sets out for a period of 2 months. But in that first set was one that described what the campus surveillance was like, where switchboard operators were paid to listen in on the phone calls of professors, mail carriers, and mid-level college administrators were working as informers for the FBI. This was new to the public. People did not know that this was going on. Every black student on the campus of Swarthmore University College, was being watched and had a file. And all the files that I received, as I look back on it, well, the ones I consider the most important were the ones that revealed the amazing surveillance, the breadth of the surveillance of the black community. There were sort of big types of actions taken against black people. For instance, discouraging every president from paying attention to the civil rights movement, and linking it with communism, and making Eisenhower, for instance, extremely reluctant to do some of the things that he had the instinct to do. But also in that first set were descriptions of the nature of the surveillance taking place in black communities, which was that, for instance, throughout the country, every FBI agent was supposed to hire at least one informer who would report to him on a regular basis about the activities of black people. And here in Washington, every FBI agent was supposed to hire at least 6 informers to report to them on a regular basis about the activities of black people. It was a strong preoccupation with the director. Now, at that time, there was an immediate outcry. It was the first time that members of Congress called for an investigation of Hoover in the FBI, and editorials appeared in most of the major papers also calling for an investigation. And that was very unusual. In such places before, it was mostly praise of Hoover that would appear. And everybody called on Senator Sam Ervin, who would become quite famous pretty soon for Watergate investigation, called on him to chair such an investigation, and he said no. And he said he thought that Mr. Hoover was doing a pretty good job. And I think that that probably caused the investigation not to take place for 4 years, more than anything else did. But in the meantime, a number of things happened, including J. Edgar Hoover dying in May 1972 and Richard Nixon's Watergate crimes, that it contributed enormously to the public wanting to know a lot more. But one very big thing that happened, somebody in this audience is responsible for, and without this, I'm not sure that things would have moved forward to an investigation by 1975. More than a year after the burglary, Carl Stern, who is here, and at that time was legal affairs reporter for NBC, saw a file, a media file, that had the term COINTELPRO at the top of it. And it was a mere routing slip. It was attached to a file, an article that I had written about, but I didn't mention the term COINTELPRO because I didn't know what it was or how it was related. But Carl had the presence of mind a little over a year ago when he saw this file for the first time on somebody's desk in the Senate Judiciary Committee office, to say, what in the world is this? And to file a request under the Freedom of Information Act with the FBI, Justice Department. And this went on, and they turned him down, kept turning him down, and then he sued. And a judge eventually ordered that the FBI provide what he was asking for, which were the papers that would explain Hoover's papers explaining the definition and purpose of COINTELPRO. And interestingly enough, the person who made the decision to release these files to Carl was none other than Robert Bork, who was acting Attorney General at the time. And also, and I don't believe that he's gotten any credit for this either, at the time that he was about to make them available to Carl, he recommended to the incoming Attorney General, Saxby, that would be Nixon's last Attorney General, that he, Saxby, should investigate COINTELPRO, investigate what the FBI was doing in COINTELPRO. He should have made that public at a crucial point in his life, maybe. But Carl found out, and that really increased public concern considerably. We found out that the COINTELPRO, which we can assume were Hoover's most vicious operations, and I say assume because these files are still emerging. Just 2 years ago, a terrific book called The Subversives about the FBI's role at University of California, especially at Berkeley, not just during the free speech movement, but from 1940s to 1970s, described some incredibly awful aspects of COINTELPRO and other FBI operations. Briefly, COINTELPRO, as he defined it, they were created to neutralize and disrupt organizations and individuals. And some went farther and destroyed individuals. Just a couple examples. They range from sort of the mundane, where somebody who would write a letter to the editor anywhere in the country that raised questions about the war, that person might be visited by the FBI, or their neighbors might be visited and a file started on them. That's mundane. And then there were crude things like injecting activist oranges with laxatives. And then there were murderous things like an FBI informer infiltrating the Panthers in Chicago, drawing a diagram for the apartment where Fred Hampton, leader of the Chicago Panthers, slept, and drawing a bed and saying Fred's bed, and giving that to the Chicago police hiring a shooter who came in and shot Fred Hampton dead in the night. And then the FBI informer was immediately thanked by the FBI for this and given a reward. And then another really awful example is the campaign against actress Jean Seberg at the time. An agent in Los Angeles proposed that they conduct a COINTELPRO operation against her because she had given a donation to the Black Panthers in Los Angeles, and came up with this rather clever thing that Hoover thought was just terrific. And the plan was she was pregnant, and that they would plant the false rumor with a gossip columnist that the father of her baby was a Black Panther. Hoover approved that, and it went back to Los Angeles. He advised him to wait a couple months till she appeared to be more pregnant, so there would be no question about who was being talked about when the rumor came out. But the people in Los Angeles couldn't wait. They immediately went to the gossip columnist and planted the rumor. And a few days later, she was extremely upset, of course, immediately. And a few days later, she gave birth to a dead white baby. And a few years later, on the anniversary of that, she committed suicide. There were many such cases, so this is a sickening exercise, I might tell you. That really increased public interest in learning more. The tipping point came in when Cy Hirsch wrote a story in the Times in December of 1974 when he revealed that the CIA was conducting domestic intelligence operations in violation of its charter. Less than a month after that, the Church Committee, and there was House and Senate Committee, were formed to conduct the first investigations of Intelligence Committee. And as you probably know, numerous reforms came out of that, including the establishment of the Congressional Oversight Committees. And I think probably one of the most meaningful ones, though, was the strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act in 1974. That has probably that's the reform that's probably made the biggest difference. And one of the differences it made was that for the first time, scholars and journalists were able to get original files and start to write the true history of the FBI. And that did take place. Just briefly, I describe my role. I received the files when I was a reporter at the Post. In 2 weeks after the burglary, I received this rather large manila envelope. It would be the first of several I would receive over 2 months. And the FBI cooperated immediately in providing what I most needed, which was authentication that the files were real. Which was, when you start reading these extreme things, it's not altogether, you can't accept the fact that they may be real. But they provided that confirmation immediately because they intended for that to convince us not to write the stories about the files. I was off in my little corner of the old Post newsroom writing the stories, having no idea that at the time, until 6 o'clock when I was done writing, that there was a very serious chance that the story would never appear. That I, in my simple way of dealing with thinking this is incredibly important information that the public needs to know, unfortunately editors agreed on that point. But Catherine Graham did not want to publish, and the counsel for the Washington Post also did not want to publish. And I think in order to understand that a little bit, I should explain that there were two firsts about this from our perspective as journalists. First time, it was the first time that a journalist had been given secret government files by outsiders who had stolen the files. So that sort of gave pause since that had never happened before. And the other thing was that it's the first time that Catherine Graham was asked demanded by the Nixon administration to suppress a story. And as you know, that would start happening many times. Like 3 months later, the Pentagon Papers came to the Washington Post. But by 10 o'clock that night, she approved the publication, and the first story appeared the next day on the front page. Now, John Mitchell also played a role that day. All afternoon, he was calling the two editors involved, Ben Bagdickian, Ben Bradley, and calling Catherine Graham with ever-increasing urgency, urging them not to publish the stories and saying that they would endanger national security and revealed military secrets. Now, we could tell, fortunately, by looking at the documents that neither of those things were true. And I found out later when I read the 34,000-page investigation of the burglary by the FBI that he had not read the files nor been briefed on them at the time that he made that claim. So many years passed, and then I accidentally found the burglars. And that may seem like a strange tale, but I was living in California and had two trips, one to Missouri for a journalism education. I was teaching journalism by that time, University of Missouri, and then the next week to the University of Massachusetts, and I had several days in between those two meetings and decided that instead of going back to California and then returning east, that I would give myself a long weekend in Philadelphia, where I had worked before I came to the Post, and where I had many former colleagues and friends I hadn't seen for a long time. So I filled up my long weekend with appointments with these people, and one after another. And the first night, I had called this couple that I had known. We weren't friends, but we were acquaintances, and we liked each other, and we hadn't been in touch for more than a decade. And they said, yes, come to dinner. And so I went to their home in suburban Philadelphia, and we had a lot to catch up on about what had been going on in our lives in the intervening years. And then we went to the dining room, and as we were eating dinner, the youngest of their 4 children, whom I had never met, came to the table, and her father said to her, Mary, we want you to know, Betty, because many years ago, when we had information about the FBI that we wanted the American people to know, we gave it to Betty.
No.
And I was amazed. And I could tell it meant nothing to her. And so rather than shock her by suddenly having an outburst, I restrained myself, and I waited till she left the room. And then I said, are you telling me that you're the media burglars? And they said yes. And I think we must have talked until 2 or 3 in the morning that night. I was truly amazed and had many questions. Now, what I also learned that night was that the 8 people had vowed to each other that they would take the secret to their graves. And so here I am, eager to tell this story already. So weeks later, I called them and I said, this is a very important story and part of history that should be told. And I hope that you'll consider breaking that silence and being willing to tell the story and help me find the other burglars and see if all of them will be willing to break that silence. And that did happen over the next few months. And that's how I came to write this book.
Great, Betty. I just congratulations, and from a fellow senior journalist. Hoorah! It's terrific. So, there are two quick questions. Were they liable in any way for criminal activity, the burglars? And second question, movie?
The statute of limitations on burglary expired 5 years afterwards. If Hoover had been alive, he may have been able to press for get them being charged under espionage statutes, but that's not what they would have been charged under after he died. They weren't following this. There was no public announcement when that 5-year period ended, and they weren't aware of what had happened, and they were, in any event, they were intending to keep it a secret. And as far as movie is concerned, maybe. But there is definitely a documentary called 1971 that will premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival on April 18th, and I'm sure will be in Washington probably not long after that. 1971, yeah.
Maybe go to the site. Go back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I want to say I read and enjoyed your book very much, and I have a question about the burglary. Because I grew up in media.
Oh.
I was in 11th grade when the burglary happened, and my question is, what my memory is that my 12th grade language arts teacher told our class that she and her young son had FBI files on them, and they were mailed to them by the burglars, copies of them, I guess, afterwards. And I wondered, did that happen? Am I remembering it wrong, or was she exaggerating?
Well, it's possible. I know one thing that happened after they mailed, and this is mostly Bill Davidon doing the mailing, after they mailed them to journalists. They were originally sent to 2 members of Congress and 3 journalists, all of whom, besides the Post, returned them to the FBI without making them public. But then, after we published stories, then everybody else started writing stories. But one thing that did happen and makes this possible is that they then started sending them to to people in organizations and to all the campuses in that area, since they were in the files. So
maybe she got from one of them.
yeah, that's possible.
Thank you.
Zero.
Why they send it to you? And the second question, because you have in New York, other newspaper, etc., why to Washington and to you? And the second, have you ever had the feeling of intimidating for someone that you don't know who in all the years since you released these articles?
Well, first question was, why me? And then I'm not sure I understand. Have I had the feeling of being
Why they send it to
intimidated?
you? How they... You have a lot of people who write story in United States. How they found you and why only they send it to you?
Well, I never knew why me until I found the burglars. As I said, I've been a reporter. I was in Washington at the time. I'm in New York now, but I was in Washington as a reporter at the Post at the time. And I didn't know why, except I had been a reporter in Philadelphia. The peace movement in Philadelphia was vast and diverse. And so it seemed logical to me that the people involved were probably from that peace movement, which I had covered part of the time while I was in Philadelphia. What really seemed unusual about the fact that I got them was that the other people were very well known, and I wasn't, the other 2 journalists. And that was Jack Nelson from the LA Times, Washington Bureau, and Tom Wicker, columnist then at the New York Times. And the very poignant part of that story is that the ones that were addressed to Jack Nelson at the LA Times never reached him. They were intercepted in the front office of the LA Times and taken directly to the FBI without his knowing it. And what I've found out since then is that first of all, I knew this for a long time, was that he was one of the very few reporters who did any kind of investigative work on the FBI. And since nobody was supposed to do that, Hoover was truly outraged at him. And at that very time, we now know from some Freedom of Information files that people in the LA Times got about 3 years ago, that he was conducting a fierce campaign to get Jack fired. And so those files so the fact that I was unknown was really a big help, I think, because nobody was watching my mailbox.
And have you, the second question was if you have any feeling of intimidating or fear after
At
you
that
release
time,
it?
you mean?
Yes.
There
Yeah.
was some. I mean, my phone, it seemed pretty clear. You can't tell when your phone is being tapped today, but then you could. Funny sound, or at least you thought you could, because you were paranoid, you weren't sure. But you heard these sounds, and I certainly had that. Plus a live voice on my home phone the next morning when I lifted the receiver, wanting to know what I was trying to do, and I was trying to dial a number, and we had a little bit of a shouting match. He seemed to disappear, and I was able to dial. And once when I was driving on the interstate in Delaware, there was a car that kept coming too close to me and then would go slower, and that was very upsetting at the time. But I can't say that I really felt intimidated. I felt mostly I got to go to the office every day to see if I have any files arriving.
Betty, great book. Really enjoyed reading it. But I feel compelled to say something about your introduction. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post, and as much respect as I have for the reporters from the 70s, and I have a great deal of respect, we tend to think that we are in a new heyday of the Washington Post, both in print and online. So there. But I do have a question. I read footnotes, I read endnotes, and I was very impressed by the depth of research you did beyond what the burglars told you. Could you talk a little bit about the craft of digging out this contextual information, which makes the book richer?
Thank you. Pat?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some people here from the JAWS listserv whom I know only by our listserv communications, and I'm very glad to meet you. I told the burglars at the beginning when I asked them if they would give up their silence and reveal their identity. I told them at the beginning that my interest was in telling their story, but not only telling their story, also telling the impact of what they did. As I thought that the impact was so tremendous. And so in telling the impact, that also meant that you had to tell a lot about the past. The challenge was, you set out to and read a lot in order to do that. And then the challenge is, how do you pull that together with the narrative of their story to write it? And that probably was my biggest challenge, as the research was very interesting to do and full of many surprises to me, such as the role of Robert Bork in helping make COINTELPRO public.
How long did you spend on that research, Betty?
Let's just say I spent many years writing this book. The combination of everything, the interviews and the research of the book, meaning interviews beyond the burglary, but also the reading of books and papers and collecting a great deal. Thank you.
Back to telephone tapping, if you would. I've not gotten very far in the book, and maybe you explain this later. I've been surprised that Professor Davidon communicated with the other burglars as much as he did by phone. Was he naive about the possibility of his phones being tapped? Were they being tapped? And from the FBI's point of view, did they simply never connect the dots on those if they had been listening?
The question, if you get here in the back, is about the tapping of phones, and that Bill Davidon communicated a lot with the burglars by phone, and was he naive? You'll come to a section where he proposes to teach the burglars about how they communicate by phone, first as little as possible. But when you do, one of them had said on the phone something like, I know I shouldn't be saying this to you. and the next time they all got together, he said, don't talk like that. One of the keys to doing something like this is to try to be as natural as possible and act as though you're not doing anything that you're hiding. And but it was inevitable, there was no email. That would have been dangerous too, of course. But it was inevitable that in order to change meeting times and so forth, that they were in touch. And those phone conversations were being tapped and transcribed. And he really was not naive about that. He wasn't surprised years later when he got his part of his FBI file to find that out. He had 2 small daughters at the time, and they were making arrangements for birthday parties and what flavor of ice cream. And the FBI was faithful in typing every bit of that down. So does that respond to your question?
But did they then just miss the boat later on and
Oh,
forget
yeah.
about all of those contacts?
It's complicated, and I won't just go into the complication because it takes down another stream. But he was also at that time, as of that January, an unindicted co-conspirator in a case that had been concocted to save J. Edgar Hoover's face, and that's another story to go into. But at any rate, because of that case, they were paying attention, and some of the things he said, like, I've been staying up all night lately, and I'm very tired, they apparently were applying to the other case. I can never be sure about that.
I think we're going to have time for whoever's left standing at a mic that has a last question. So a couple over there and a few over here. Okay.
So I had a related question to that following the investigation. I was at Haverford from 78 to 82. I actually interviewed Bill for a peace and global studies class because of his involvement in the Harrisburg 7 as an unindicted co-conspirator. And didn't get a lot out of him. Now I know why. For cause, he did. But it did. But similar to this, following the break-in, the investigation with 200 FBI agents. I mean, he was clearly, in this milieu with the Berrigan brothers. That's what I interviewed him about. And did they, in any reporting or any investigation you've done into the FBI investigation, like how close did they get? Did they just not make any connections? How could they, well, we know they can misapply resources,
case.
But how did they, in their subsequent investigation, wouldn't he have been a natural suspect? And, why didn't they get any closer to the
You're
gang?
exactly right, of course. He was a natural suspect, and he was a suspect. But a kind of unbelievable thing happened that saved him. The first indictment in the Harrisburg case, in which he was named an unindicted co-conspirator, came down in January, like the 3rd week of January. And after the media burglary, the FBI immediately, agents in the Philadelphia area, immediately wanted to try to talk to him and investigate him. And the people at the Justice Department knew that the indictment that they had brought down wasn't going to work, and that they wanted to bring down a superseding indictment that they felt sure they would get a conviction on. They didn't. But as part of that, the prosecutor in charge of the grand jury that was continuing issued an order that the FBI must not talk to him because he was under suspicion, and they wanted to get him in that case. And so they didn't interview him. They did interview some of the others. But the thing that's even more surprising to me is that in April, the superseding indictment came down, and he was not named a defendant, as they had said he would be. And they still didn't interview him, and never did. So, I also would like to say to you that not long before Bill died last fall, I learned that the only reporter who ever asked him if he was a media burglar was a student at Haverford. Another student.
Hi. I wanted to just follow up a little bit on what was just said. My husband and I were among the founders of the Philadelphia Resistance back then, along with Judy Chomsky, and we had left Philadelphia because I'd returned to grad school in 1971, but we're very close to Bill Davidon, and we're at his memorial service, which I just learned when we spoke before that you were at also. And I happened to say to Keith Forsythe, who was known to all of us as the locksmith, I said, okay, when are we going to learn who did media? And he said, just wait. Front page, New York Times, January. And lo and behold, there it was. So really, congratulations. This is just wonderful. But I had two questions I wanted to ask you about. You mention in the book that Deep Throat was one of the FBI agents who was first put on the case. And then I think it was kind of dropped. I haven't quite finished the book, but I wanted to hear about his role. And also, if you could tie it to the NSA and the Snowden case now and so on, and what some of your thoughts about what the parallels are and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As for Deep Throat, he didn't investigate the case, but the morning after the burglary, he happened to be in New York. He was in charge of inspections of FBI offices at that time and had been for about a decade, which means that he was in charge of enforcing the fact that COINTELPRO operations happened, which hasn't come out in your major sources about Deep Throat. But he was, that morning when Philadelphia called the headquarters in Washington and said, there's been a burglary at the media office. They called him immediately. Washington called him and told him to drop the inspection of the New York office and get to media. And so his function began and ended that morning. But it was an important moment because his sole responsibility was to find a scapegoat for the burglary. And that was the man who was in charge of the media office. And I report in there a series of lies that he manufactured in order to make sure that this man was given the responsibility for the burglary. And it's not a nice tale. As for the front page, what Keith said about the front page, as my husband can attest, we knew that the stories were supposed to appear on pub day, and I never take such things for granted. But it looked like it was going to happen. And I just want you to know that we did a lot of praying that Sharon was going to live for at least 2 more days. We knew that we'd have no chance being on the front page if that was the case. Yes.
Did you want to actually address the other part, though, about Snowden, or do you want to?
I was.
Okay, it's too.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that there are quite a few parallels. If you just isolate it to looking at the motivations of the stated motivations of the burglars then and of Snowden now, they both had the same intention, that there is out of control surveillance that the public needs to know about, has no idea is happening, and that they're going to take great risks to make it happen. I mean, one big difference is that Snowden's an insider and knew exactly what he was putting out, whereas they were outsiders and they could have gone to prison for years for nothing if they had not found anything significant. Something else I was going to say. And yeah, I think as far as intentions are concerned, I know the other thing was the business of harming individuals, that in both cases the people putting out the information went to great lengths to make a point of not putting out information that would damage individuals, or in the case of the burglars, they did not put out cases that about organized crime, of which only 1% was the case, but or other crimes that the FBI would justifiably be investigating. But they did find that nearly 60% of the files were politically related files. And that's, the Snowden has also said that he went to, and if you think of all the stories that you've read about the Snowden files, no individual is ever named in any of them.
My last question, I mean, the last question, is sort of maybe leading back to the very beginning of all this, but I'm asking on behalf of my father, Bill Mackay, who used to work with you at the Post, right? And I get
My colleague.
Yes, but he was wondering if the reason that if your first contact was a particular story that he's remembering, that you traveled to Pennsylvania to interview some of the peace activists. Do you remember like an early part, a reason that they then, getting back to the other gentleman's question about the why did they send to you? You don't have an inkling of an earlier like contact with any of those
I
folks?
think I know what Bill's referring to. And that was it. I interviewed Dan Berrigan in the Underground.
It must be it.
In
He
the
mentioned
August
Catholic
before.
activists particularly, right?
Right. But I think that the bigger reason for it being me was because I was a reporter whose work they were familiar with in Philadelphia and after I went to the Washington Post.
Right.
And that may have played a role. I don't
but
know.
he also sends his regrets that he couldn't come today. Really is excited about your book. So
Thank you
congratulations.
very much. Thank you.